Hello, welcome back. Get comfortable. Tonight we're going to spend quite a long time talking about The Mandalorian and Grogu, the film that just opened over Memorial Day weekend, and which, depending on who you ask, was either a perfectly reasonable family adventure or a quiet slow-motion disappointment that said more about the current state of Star Wars than anyone at Lucasfilm would really like to admit. I think it's both of those things actually, which is kind of what makes it interesting. Because this isn't a disaster in the theatrical sense. It's not the rise of Skywalker, all noise and chaos, and too many storylines crashing into each other at speed. This is a much more subdued kind of disappointment, a beige one, if you want to be precise about it. The kind that doesn't shout at you so much as leave you sitting in the car park afterwards thinking, was that it then? 7 years without a Star Wars film in cinemas? 7 years of Disney Plus series and spin-offs and streaming experiments, some of which were genuinely excellent and some of which were very much not. And then finally, a theatrical release, a big one. A Memorial Day weekend event with an IMAX run and a proper marketing push and Pedro Pascal's face on 1,000 bus shelters. And the best thing most people could find to say about it was that it was fine. There's something genuinely worth thinking about in that response, the collective shrug, and that's what we're going to do tonight. Take a very long, very unhurried walk through how we got here, starting from a season finale that felt like a perfect ending, moving through 3 years of quietly accumulating problems, and arriving at a film that earned a 63% on Rotten Tomatoes and an A cinema score simultaneously, which tells you everything you need to know about who this movie was actually made for. If you like what I do here and you want to support the channel, subscribing is the most useful thing. But for now, get settled, turn the lights down, and let's begin. There's a specific kind of frustration that comes from watching something get a perfect ending and then watching the people responsible for it decide, for reasons that are probably financial and possibly ego-related, that they couldn't just leave it alone. The Mandalorian Season 2 finale, Chapter 16, The Rescue, is one of the most satisfying hours of television that Disney Plus has ever produced. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. Even people who had complicated feelings about the show's second season generally agreed that the finale stuck the landing in a way that felt genuinely earned. Mando and his crew storm Moff Gideon's cruiser. Grogu gets taken by an X-Wing pilot, who turns out to be, and this was a genuine shock at the time, a digitally de-aged Luke Skywalker, and Din Djarin, in what is probably the single most meaningful act of the entire series, removes his helmet to say goodbye to his child. He hadn't shown his face to a living being since he was a foundling. That was the rule. That was the whole thing about him. The helmet, the creed, the way he'd built an entire identity out of a set of customs he'd adopted as a frightened orphan child. And he takes it off because Grogu needs to see his face. Because at the end of everything, the creed matters less than the kid. It's a small, quiet moment, and it's absolutely devastating if you've been paying attention. And then the credits roll, and Grogu goes off to train with Luke Skywalker, and Mando flies away. The end. Or it should have been. What made that ending work wasn't just the emotional payoff of the moment itself, it was the structural completeness of it. The Mandalorian had always been, at its core, a show about a man who didn't know how to want things for himself, learning to care about something outside of the creed and the next job. Season 1 is basically, reluctant protector realizes he loves this weird little creature and does something profoundly against his own interests to keep him safe. Season 2 is, he builds a found family while searching for a place this child belongs. And when he finds it, he lets him go. That's a story with a beginning, middle and end. It's structurally complete. Now, the sensible thing to do after that would have been to let it breathe for a bit. Maybe come back with a new season that picked up the emotional thread of what Mando does next, now that the foundling is gone. What does Din Djarin want when the mission is over? That's an interesting question. It's the kind of question that could carry a whole season, What actually happened is that the creative team made a show called The Book of Boh Fett, which was nominally about Boh Fett reclaiming Jabu the Hutt's territory on Tatooine, and then spent 2 of its 7 episodes essentially making a secret continuation of the Mandalorian instead. We got Din Djarin getting a new ship, we got him visiting Grogu at Luke's temple, and most significantly, we got Grogu choosing to leave Luke and return to Mando, abandoning his Jedi training, undoing the emotional weight of Season 2's ending, and resetting the status quo before Season 3 even started. That decision to reunite them in a completely different show, without giving either character the space to actually live with their separation, was the first real crack in the foundation. Not because it was a catastrophic creative choice on its own, but because of what it revealed about how Lucasfilm was thinking about these characters. They were too valuable to let grow. The Mando and Grogu dynamic was a merchandising goldmine and a reliable audience draw, and the idea of spending a whole season exploring what Mando is like without the kid was apparently too risky a proposition. The frustrating thing is that the reunion itself didn't even get to be a meaningful scene, because it happened in a show most casual fans weren't necessarily following closely. So Season 3 opened with Mando and Grogu already back together, the emotional weight of Season 2's goodbye simply gone. Viewers who hadn't watched the Book of Boba Fett were understandably baffled. Viewers who had watched it were left wondering why the most important emotional beat of the whole show had been dispatched so quickly and in such an odd venue. And then Season 3 arrived, and rather than asking interesting questions about what Din Djarin wants now that his foundling is back, it went in about 11 different directions at once. Mandalore, Bo-Katan's redemption arc, Dr. Pershing on Coruscant, the Armorer's Doctrine, a whole new cast of Mandalorian characters. It was busy in a way that felt unfocused rather than ambitious. We'll get into the specifics of Season 3 in a bit, but the important thing to note here is that the moment the team decided to walk back that Season 2 ending, they set themselves on a path that eventually led to the film. There's a version of The Mandalorian and Grogu that works as a theatrical film. I genuinely believe that. The characters are beloved, the world is rich, the father and son dynamic has real emotional texture when it's handled well. But to make that film, you'd need the emotional stakes to feel urgent. You'd need the audience to be invested in where these characters are going, not just comfortable with where they've always been. The trouble is that by the time the film arrived, the show had spent 2.5 seasons carefully avoiding the question of where these characters were actually going. And you can't build a satisfying destination when you've spent that long refusing to chart a course. There's also something worth saying about the specific creative discipline that Season 2 demonstrated. The show ran 8 episodes, none of them overly long, each with a clarity of purpose that the later seasons often lacked. The season structure was built around a single quest: find a Jedi for Grogu, and every episode contributed to that quest in some way, even the ones that appeared to be standalone adventures. The Frog Lady episode, the Boh Fett reunion, the Ahsoka episode that revealed Grogu's name and history, all of them were doing double duty, advancing the emotional story while also functioning as distinct self-contained experiences. That kind of structural economy, where no episode wastes the audience's time, requires a confidence in the material and a willingness to cut anything that doesn't serve the larger purpose. It's harder to maintain than it looks. What made Chapter 16 such a satisfying finale was partly the accumulated trust the season had built. By the time Luke Skywalker appeared in that corridor, the audience had been given reason to believe the show would honour its own emotional stakes. The show had earned the right to a moment of genuine feeling, and it delivered one. That's a different experience from watching a finale that's trying to create emotional impact from scratch, without the backing of a season that has done the work. The weight of the Season 2 finale came from everything before it. I keep coming back to that Season 2 finale. The way it felt, in the moment, like a chapter had actually closed. There's a particular satisfaction in that, when a story earns its ending, when the emotional logic holds, when the characters arrive somewhere and you believe they've actually arrived there. It's not that common, and the fact that it happened here with these characters in what was essentially a streaming TV western felt genuinely special at the time. It's a shame they couldn't just let it be. Something that I think gets lost in the discourse around that season 2 finale is how carefully everything leading up to it had been constructed. The show spent 2 seasons building a man who defined himself entirely through a set of rules, and then showed you, incrementally and without announcement, that those rules were changing. The helmet came off once before, for a medical scanner technically, which the show acknowledged was a grey area, and the way that moment was played suggested a character aware that his faith was being tested by circumstance. By the time he removes it willingly, for Grogu, the choice carries the full weight of everything that came before it. You feel how much it costs him. And that kind of accumulated emotional investment is extraordinarily rare in franchise television. The Luke Skywalker reveal was the other thing that made the finale remarkable, and it's worth taking a moment to think about why it hit as hard as it did. The choice to use a digitally de-aged Luke, controversial in some quarters, given the uncanny valley concerns that digital face replacement had generated in previous projects, worked in this context, partly because it was a complete surprise. Nobody had actually leaked it. The audience had no preparation for it. He simply appeared, green lightsaber igniting in the dark of a corridor, and the sound of the Imperial March gave way to something quieter and more affecting. The reaction videos that circulated afterwards captured something real. People crying at a Star Wars streaming episode in a way that the theatrical films of the preceding decade hadn't consistently managed. That's significant. What made it work emotionally, beyond the spectacle of the reveal itself, was context. Luke Skywalker appearing at this specific moment meant something to the show's story. It was the answer to the question the season had been building towards. Grogu needed a Jedi. Here was a Jedi, but it also meant something to the audience's history with the franchise. Luke represents the end of the original trilogy's promise, the completion of a hero's journey that began in 1977. His presence at the moment of Grogu's departure invested that departure with resonance that extended well beyond the narrative. It connected the smallest story, a foundling and his reluctant guardian, to the largest one. That connection felt earned rather than manufactured. The decision to immediately undo it, to make Grogu choose to return to Mando before the emotional weight of the departure had any time to settle, was, I think, a decision made from a position of commercial anxiety rather than creative confidence. The Mando and Grogu duo is the franchise's most reliable source of warmth and merchandise opportunity. Separating them, even temporarily, even for the purpose of asking interesting questions about who Din Djarin is without his foundling, felt risky in a way that the decision-makers apparently decided they couldn't afford. And so the separation that the Season 2 finale had earned, that beautiful, costly ending, was walked back in a different show, quietly, before it could develop into anything. I understand the commercial logic. I think it was still the wrong call, and I think the film is, in a very direct way, the consequence of it. I want to be fair to Season 3 of The Mandalorian, because I think it gets lumped in with the broader Disney Plus Star Wars fatigue in a way that's a bit reductive. It's not the Book of Boba Fett, which had genuinely strange structural problems. It's not The Acolyte, which had a whole separate set of issues. Season 3 is more interesting than simply bad. It's a show that seemed confused about what it was trying to be, which is in some ways a more instructive failure than outright incompetence. Let me explain what I mean. The premise of Season 3, broadly, is that Din Djarin wants to be forgiven by his Mandalorian covenants for having removed his helmet, and to achieve this he needs to bathe in the living waters beneath the mines of Mandalore, which everyone believed to be uninhabitable after an Imperial purge. So the first thing the season does is send him to Mandalore, which is interesting, and he bathes in the living waters relatively quickly, which resolves the main dramatic premise of the season by episode 2. And then the show goes off to spend an episode on Coruscant, following Dr. Pershing, a character from season 1 who the audience hadn't thought about much, as he tries to adjust to civilian life under the New Republic's amnesty program. It's actually a reasonably well-made episode, but it has almost nothing to do with the main through line of the season, and it arrives at exactly the moment when the show had built up a bit of momentum. That pattern repeats itself throughout season 3. Something interesting starts to happen, and then the show sidesteps it for something that feels more like world building than storytelling. The mythosaur, an ancient Mandalorian creature of enormous significance, appears to Bo-Katan in the living waters in a moment that clearly promises something major. It's never followed up on in any meaningful way within the season itself. It's just a thing that happened. Bo-Katan's arc is probably the clearest illustration of the season's structural problems. She starts the season as a disillusioned former rebel leader who's lost faith in the idea of reclaiming Mandalore. The obvious trajectory for her character would be a journey toward choosing to lead again, making an active, costly decision to take responsibility for her people. What actually happens is that the decision essentially gets made for her. She sees the mythosaur, she's welcomed into the covert by the armourer, she's handed the darksaber earlier in the season, and Moff Gideon later destroys it in battle. She ends the season as the effective leader of a reunited Mandalore, but very few of those outcomes resulted from a genuine choice she made under pressure. Things happened to her. She received rather than chose. That's a subtle distinction, but it matters enormously in terms of whether an arc feels earned. And it's a pattern that runs through the whole show, characters being moved around by plot requirements rather than driven by their own internal logic. The viewership numbers reflected the audience's ambivalence. Season 3 saw a decline of roughly 20% in total minutes viewed compared to Season 2, which is a significant drop for what was supposed to be Disney Plus's flagship Star Wars series. Samba TV's numbers confirmed a meaningful fall in viewership from the premiere. It was still a popular show by any reasonable measure, but the gap between the cultural moment The Mandalorian had been in 2019 and 2020, and what it was in 2023 had become quite obvious. And here's the detail I find oddly poignant. Season 3's premiere actually trailed the Book of Boba Fett in viewership, which, given how mixed the reception to that show was, tells you something about how much the gap between Season 2 and Season 3 had cost the series in terms of audience investment. People had drifted. The adventure of the week format that had made Season 1 so charming, a clean mission structure, simple stakes, intimate character moments, a galaxy that felt genuinely varied and surprising, had been almost entirely replaced by a web of interconnected lore obligations. Season 3 was busy with Star Wars Rebels callbacks, and New Republic politics, and Mandalorian cultural history, and Imperial remnant threads, and most of it was technically fine, but none of it was especially engaging. It kept circling back to the same Imperial holdout narrative that the films had spent 40 years on, and it was becoming harder and harder to find a compelling reason to care about another group of stormtroopers with a Moff. What makes me slightly sad about Season 3 in retrospect is that there were good ideas in it. The episode with the pirates was fun, in the way early Mandalorian episodes were fun. There were some lovely moments between Mando and Grogu that captured something of the first season's warmth. The production design remained excellent. The score was still Ludwig Göransson, who could make a man filing his tax return feel cinematically significant. But it's hard to escape the feeling that by the end of Season 3, the show had used up a lot of its goodwill without replacing it with anything of comparable substance. And when Lucasfilm announced they were pivoting to a theatrical film rather than a fourth season, there was a very specific flavour to the fan response. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of cautious wait and see, which when you're launching a theatrical franchise revival after a 7-year gap, is probably not the energy you were hoping for. Season 3 didn't kill the Mandalorian, but it left it in a weakened state, narratively, and in terms of audience engagement, just when the film needed it to be strong. The foundation that the movie was being built on had developed some noticeable cracks, and unlike the scrapes and dents on Mando's Beskar armor, those cracks weren't purely cosmetic. One thing I want to give Season 3 credit for, in the interest of fairness, is its visual ambition. The episode set on Mandalore itself, the reclaimed homeworld, the underground lakes, the specific desolation of a planet that had been deliberately destroyed by the Empire, were genuinely striking. The production design team did extraordinary work creating a world that felt ancient and sad, and the colours of Mandalore have a muted ash-grey quality that's quite unlike anything else in the Star Wars visual vocabulary. When the season remembered that it was telling a story about a people trying to rebuild after catastrophic loss, it occasionally achieved something close to the emotional register it was aiming for. The problem was that the season kept forgetting to tell that story. A show about the reclamation of Mandalore, with the culture and politics and human cost of that reclamation at its centre, would have been genuinely interesting. The show got distracted by everything adjacent to that story: the New Republic bureaucracy, the Coruscant thread, the Imperial Remnant subplot, and by the time it returned to Mandalore for the season's conclusion, it felt less like a culmination and more like a resolution that had been scheduled rather than earned. There's also a specific thing worth noting about the role of Grogu in Season 3, which is that the show seemed genuinely unsure what to do with him now that the Find a Jedi for the Child mission was resolved. In Seasons 1 and 2, Grogu's mysterious nature and uncertain future gave the series a through line. Every episode existed within that larger quest. Once the quest was completed, and then immediately reversed, Grogu's role in the story became somewhat undefined. He accompanies Mando. He does force things when required. He's adorable and occasionally useful in action sequences. But the specific dramatic purpose he served in the earlier seasons, as the embodiment of the question, what does this man owe to something helpless and extraordinary, had been answered, and nobody had replaced it with a new question of equal weight. That's a structural problem that carries directly into the film. By the time the movie arrives, Grogu is a beloved companion rather than a narrative engine. He's present and charming and delightful, but he no longer drives the story. He's a passenger. And that shift from the character who gave the show its emotional core to a very appealing piece of emotional backdrop is one of the quieter losses of the later seasons. In January 2024, Lucasfilm made an announcement that surprised quite a few people who'd been following the Star Wars streaming landscape. Rather than continuing with a fourth season of The Mandalorian on Disney+, the story of Din Djarin and Grogu would instead move to theatrical release. Jon Favreau would direct a feature film, The Mandalorian and Grogu, set for May 22nd, 2026. No Season 4, just a film. The official language around the announcement was enthusiastic in that corporate way that official announcements are always enthusiastic. Kathleen Kennedy described it as a new story that was a perfect fit for the big screen. Favreau talked about the prospect of bringing these characters to theatrical audiences. The accompanying artwork showed Mando and Grogu fleeing an explosion, which is a perfectly acceptable piece of promotional material that tells you absolutely nothing about what kind of film this would be. The less official version of why this happened is probably a bit more complicated. Season 3 had underperformed, at least by the standards the show had set for itself in its first 2 years. The wider Disney Plus Star Wars content pipeline had delivered mixed results. Obi-Wan Kenobi was divisive, the Book of Boba Fett was disappointing for many, Ahsoka had a dedicated fan base but didn't break through to wider audiences in the way Disney needed. Andor, which was genuinely excellent, had found critical acclaim but more modest viewership than the company would have liked from a prestige streaming investment. And Skeleton Crew, a holiday season kids adventure with a Goonies in space premise, arrived to fairly dismal numbers despite the timing. Against that backdrop, pivoting the flagship characters to a theatrical event made a certain strategic sense. The cinema is different from streaming. It demands commitment. It creates a shared social experience. It generates a different kind of cultural conversation than something you watch on your sofa on a Tuesday. A theatrical Star Wars event, the first since 2019, felt like it could reset the conversation about the franchise in a way that another streaming season probably couldn't. There's also a more practical reason. Reports from industry sources suggested that Season 4 had been in various stages of development for some time, and that the material being worked on amounted to roughly 3 to 4 feature-length episodes of television. At some point, someone apparently looked at what they had and decided it made more sense to pivot to a new theatrical film instead of continuing with the Disney Plus season. The budget for the film was approximately $125 million after tax incentives, meaningful but not enormous by modern blockbuster standards, and was more aligned with a condensed production than a full series run. The problem with that logic, which in retrospect seems quite obvious, is that it only works if the material you're adapting is designed for cinematic storytelling in the first place. 3 episodes of television stitched together is not the same thing as a film. It resembles a film, certainly. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. But the emotional architecture is different. The pacing expectations are different. And the question a cinema audience walks in asking, which is essentially, why does this warrant my full attention in a darkened room, is a different question than the one a streaming audience asks. The comparison that haunted the film's pre-release period was Solo, a Star Wars story. Released in 2018 during a Memorial Day weekend that's very similar to this one, Solo was a film that had gone through significant production difficulties. The original directors, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, were fired and replaced by Ron Howard, and had opened to numbers that were, by Star Wars standards, worrying. Solo ultimately became the only live-action Star Wars film to be considered a genuine box office disappointment, and its underperformance led Lucasfilm to shelve the planned series of standalone character films. It's the cautionary tale that everyone in the industry keeps reaching for when talking about the Mandalorian and Grogu. There's a slightly unfair quality to that comparison. The situations are different in several meaningful ways, and Solo's problems were compounded by its chaotic production in a way that the Favreau film wasn't. But the comparison stuck because both films share the same fundamental challenge. They're asking audiences who have grown somewhat ambivalent about Star Wars to recommit to theatrical tickets, and they're doing it on a holiday weekend against stiff family competition. Whether the theatrical pivot was the right call is genuinely hard to say. There's an argument that a tightly constructed 4-season run of The Mandalorian with a proper ending might have been more satisfying for the characters and the audience. There's also an argument that the streaming model had run its course for this particular story, and that cinema was the only venue that could give it the kind of reset it needed. Both arguments have merit, and the fact that you can make both arguments with equal plausibility is probably itself a sign that the decision was made more for business reasons than creative ones. Which is fine, honestly. Businesses make business decisions. That's not a scandal. But it does mean you're starting with a compromised creative premise, material shaped by a different delivery context, repurposed for something it wasn't originally designed to be. And those compromises tend to show. There's another dimension to the theatrical pivot that doesn't get discussed as much as it probably should, and it involves Dave Filoni. Filoni has been at Lucasfilm for over a decade and a half, joining under George Lucas's tenure and working across essentially every major animation project, The Clone Wars, Rebels, The Bad Batch, before transitioning to live-action production. He serves as something like the creative steward of the Star Wars universe's broader continuity, particularly the era that the Mandalorian inhabits. Filoni has a grand design for the Mandoverse, a connected story that runs through the Mandalorian, the book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and now this film, building towards something that he has described in interviews as an era-defining climactic event in this post-return of the Jedi timeline. The Mandalorian and Grogu film exists partly as a piece of that larger structure, a chapter in Filoni's extended narrative rather than a self-contained cinematic story. And that framing explains some of the film's choices that otherwise feel puzzling. The Imperial Warlord isn't the franchise's final villain, he's a stepping stone. The mission in this film isn't the culmination of anything, it's set up for what comes next. The fetch quest structure isn't careless plotting, it's the delivery of narrative chess pieces to their required positions. Understanding this doesn't make the film more satisfying as cinema, but it does make the creative choices more legible. The problem is that Filoni's grand design, whatever its ultimate shape, requires a level of franchise engagement from the audience that a theatrical film simply cannot assume. You can't build to a climactic television-scaled event if the audience for the cinematic chapters doesn't know or doesn't care about the television context. And the box office data suggests that a meaningful portion of the people who bought tickets to The Mandalorian and Grogu were families who liked the characters without necessarily being invested in the broader Filoni tapestry. There's something almost admirable about the ambition, honestly. Telling a coherent, multi-series story across multiple streaming shows and theatrical films is not a small undertaking. The Marvel Cinematic Universe did something like it, with varying degrees of success, across many years and dozens of projects. Whether Star Wars can sustain the same kind of interconnected storytelling, and whether audiences in 2026 have the appetite for it, feels genuinely uncertain. But I appreciate that someone at Lucasfilm is thinking about long-term narrative architecture, rather than just producing isolated content units, even if the film that results from that architecture doesn't always feel like it can stand on its own. Let me walk through what actually happens in The Mandalorian and Grogu, because I think it's genuinely useful context for everything else we're going to talk about. And also because the plot is it's quite something. The film opens on a snowy planet. There's an Imperial warlord coordinating what remains of the Imperial remnant from a fortified position, and Mando descends from the sky in full Beskar armor to dismantle the whole operation, which he does with considerable efficiency. There's a tremendous sequence involving two Attack walkers, those enormous four-legged Imperial assault vehicles from The Empire Strikes Back, and Mando bringing one of them down from a mountainside in a slow, spectacular fall. It's a genuinely well-constructed action sequence. It justifies the IMAX screen. I don't have much to say against it, except that it sets up an energy level that the rest of the film doesn't quite maintain. After dealing with the Imperials, Mando returns to New Republic base camp and is assigned his next mission by Colonel Ward, played by Sigourney Weaver, who we'll spend more time on later. The mission? Travel to Nal Hutta, the swampy homeworld of the Hutts, and arrange the rescue of Rotta the Hutt. Rotta is the son of Jabba, the enormous slug-shaped crime lord who Han Solo owed money to, who Leia killed in Return of the Jedi. Rotta has been taken captive by a warlord gangster called Jarro, who's running him as a gladiatorial fighter. The deal is, rescue Rotta, and the Hutt family will give Mando information about the location of a significant Imperial target. Mando agrees, somewhat reluctantly, and then they go and rescue Rotta. There's a gladiatorial arena involved, and a fairly large creature that functions like a rancor, and Jeremy Allen White voicing Rotta with a kind of bemused swagger that's genuinely more charming than it has any right to be. Grogu does cute things involving the Force. The rescue is accomplished. The Hutts provide the promised information. There's also a sequence on a swamp planet where Grogu reunites with Babu Frick, the tiny alien droid engineer from The Rise of Skywalker, and a group of creatures called the Anzalans. It's primarily comedic, it runs quite long, and it's clearly there because children will love it, and because the Grogu plus tiny creature combination is a reliable source of merchandise opportunities. It stops the film's momentum almost completely, but children will probably love it, so. The final act involves the actual confrontation with the Imperial target, a Colosseum battle with hulking droids, and the kind of large-scale chaos that costs a lot of money to produce. There are genuine spectacle moments here, and then it ends. The thing is, and this is the observation that almost every critic made in some form, if this had been a 3-episode arc in a 4th season of The Mandalorian on Disney+, it would have been a perfectly solid run of episodes. The gladiatorial arena episode would have been a fan favourite. The AT-AT opener would have been a season premiere highlight. The Swamp Planet comedy would have been that episode people watched with their kids on a Saturday morning. None of it is bad television, but as cinema, as the thing you spend 20 quid on a ticket for, settle into an IMAX seat for, give 2 hours and 12 minutes of your full undivided attention to, it doesn't quite justify itself. The stakes feel television-sized. The characters end the film in approximately the same emotional position they were in when it started. There is no transformation, no irreversible change, no moment that makes you feel like the galaxy has shifted in some fundamental way. Rotter the Hutt, to his credit, has some genuine lore depth worth mentioning. He's not a new character invented for this film. Rotter appeared as a baby Huttlet in the 2008 Star Wars, the Clone Wars animated film, where Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano were tasked with rescuing him from a Confederate kidnapping plot. He was known as Stinky in that film, which is the kind of detail that makes the Star Wars universe genuinely charming. Decades later, now voiced by Jeremy Allen White, he's somehow grown into a muscular arena fighter with a complicated relationship with his family's criminal legacy. That's interesting. I'd watch more of Rotter. The problem is we don't really get more of Rotter in this film. He appears, serves his plot function, and the movie moves on. And that's the structural issue at the heart of the fetch quest problem. Every element in the film is introduced, used for its plot function, and then set aside before it can develop into anything more interesting. Jarrow the gangster is threatening and then defeated. Rotter the Hutt is charming and then rescued. Colonel Ward is authoritative and then largely peripheral. The Imperial warlord is menacing and then resolved. None of these characters has time to become genuinely compelling because the script is too busy moving from task to task. The movie gets a task, accomplishes it, and moves on to a new task. That's not a film structure. It's a game structure. It's 3 episodes of television, with the end of episode credits removed and the word intermission painted over the join. And the result is that, by the final act, when the film is trying to generate the emotional investments it needs for its climax to land, there isn't quite enough there to draw on. The action is impressive. The visuals are expensive. But the feeling that anything truly significant is at stake, that's harder to locate. There's a tonal problem that runs alongside the structural one, and it's worth pausing on. The film oscillates between 2 registers that don't sit entirely comfortably together. The dark, morally serious tone of the Imperial remnant plot, in which actual atrocities are implied and real geopolitical stakes are in play, and the broad, warm, children's entertainment tone of the Grogu and small creatures comedy sequences. Neither register is wrong. Both have precedent within Star Wars. The Empire Strikes Back could be devastating, and then comedic, and then devastating again, and it felt coherent because the transitions were handled with care. Here, the shifts feel more abrupt. The AT-AT sequence establishes a fairly intense action thriller register. Then the Anzalan Swamp Planet sequence essentially stops the film to let tiny creatures squeak and tumble over each other for several minutes. Then the gladiatorial arena attempts to restore something of the earlier intensity. The effect is somewhat disorientating, not because either tone is wrong, but because the film doesn't seem to know how to transition between them in a way that maintains a consistent emotional experience. The gladiatorial arena deserves a bit more attention than it often gets in reviews, actually. The concept that Rotter has been forced into combat for the entertainment of a galactic criminal enterprise is darker than most of what the family-friendly segments of the film attempt, and the staging of the arena itself is impressive work from the production design team. There's a creature in the arena sequence that serves a Rancor equivalent function. It is enormous, terrifying, not entirely of this world, and the practical plus digital work that brings it to life is among the film's better visual achievements. Had the film committed more fully to this register and built the arena sequence into the kind of set piece that carries genuine threat and consequence, it might have landed more powerfully. As it stands, it's good but somewhat truncated, resolved before it can develop into anything genuinely harrowing. What I keep thinking about with the fetch quest structure is the alternative. There's a version of this film where the rescue mission to Nal Hutta has a real cost, where something is lost, where Din Djarin is forced to make a choice that changes him, where the galaxy feels even slightly different by the end than it did at the beginning. That film would be harder to make. It would require the creative team to be willing to take risks with characters who are extremely valuable commercial properties. It would mean accepting that some sections of the audience might be uncomfortable or saddened. It's the version of the film that would be talked about for years rather than months. I'm not sure it was ever seriously contemplated. One other thing worth noting about the fetch quest structure, since we're here, is what it reveals about Jon Favreau as director of this particular material. His strengths are in warmth and performance and scenes where two characters feel genuinely present with each other. The Mandalorian Season 1 played to those strengths almost perfectly. It was intimate, dry in its humour, primarily built around two characters rather than a large canvas plot. The film asks him to operate at a different scale, with a complexity of interconnected storylines that doesn't suit him as naturally. The connective tissue between action sequences, the drama and character work that should make those sequences feel consequential, is thinner than it would be in the hands of a director, more invested in those particular elements. That's not a criticism of his filmmaking broadly. It's a mismatch between the project and who was best suited to lead it. Let me talk about the protagonist for a moment, because I think the specific challenge that Din Djarin poses as a character is both underappreciated and central to why this film feels as thin as it does. Mando is a fascinating concept that creates enormous structural difficulties. The concept? A man who, as a matter of deep religious conviction, cannot show his face to any living being. His identity is entirely constructed through voice, body language, and the reactions of other characters. There is no face to read. There are no eyes. When Din Djarin is uncertain or frightened or tender or cold, none of that can be communicated through the most fundamental expressive instrument available to an actor, the human face. In the hands of the right performer, and with writing that supports this limitation creatively, this is an interesting constraint. Pedro Pascal solved it for the first 2 seasons by being extraordinary at communicating emotional states through the angle of his head, the set of his shoulders, and the precise quality of his silences. There's a scene in Season 1 where Mando is sitting in the Razor Crest, holding the child, and the ship's crew quarters are cramped and dark and quiet, and you understand with complete clarity how profoundly this man is surprised by his own capacity for affection. Pascal does that with his posture and a long beat of stillness. It's remarkable work. By Season 3, the helmet had become, for much of the production, something that a stunt performer wore rather than Pedro Pascal. Pascal has spoken fairly openly about how physically demanding the armour is and about his commitments to other projects. The Last of Us was filming around the same period. Fantastic Four was coming, and a significant portion of Season 3 had him providing voice only, with physical performance handled by others. The result was a noticeable flattening of the character. Mando stopped feeling like a specific person and started feeling like a humanoid shape in expensive armor. The film reportedly addressed this by bringing Pascal more fully back into the physical performance, and Jon Favreau confirmed in pre-release interviews that we'd see Din in the armor, both with and without the helmet. And that's true, there are more helmetless moments here than in Season 3, and Pascal clearly brings more of himself to the physical role. But the writing doesn't give him enough to work with. The specific criticism that appears across several reviews, and that I think is fair, is that Din Djarin in this film has almost no personal stake in what he's doing. He's working for the New Republic because they asked him to. He's rescuing Rotta because it was the job. He's fighting Imperials because that's what he does. His motivation is entirely external institutional obligation, rather than anything that connects to who this man actually is, or what he's lost, or what he's afraid of, or what he wants. One review noted that Mando treats Grogu in this film the way you treat a well-trained dog, commands like heel and stay, which was charming and even funny when the character was a guarded, solitary bounty hunter who'd reluctantly taken on a dependent. 6 years later, after multiple seasons of his relationship with Grogu being the emotional core of the entire franchise, it plays differently. It reads as a failure of imagination about where this dynamic could have gone. There's also the question of character development, specifically the absence of it. The film doesn't move Din Djarin anywhere. He begins the film as an experienced New Republic operative with a complicated relationship to his Mandalorian identity and a deep bond with his foundling. He ends the film as an experienced New Republic operative with a complicated relationship to his Mandalorian identity and a deep bond with his foundling. The mission has been completed. Nothing has changed. And here's the thing about that. It's not inevitable. A film about a man who rebuilt his identity around a set of rules, stripped that identity down for love, and is now trying to figure out who he is without the old framework could be genuinely compelling. The question, what does Din Djarin want now that the thing he wanted most is safely by his side, is an interesting question. The film just doesn't seem particularly interested in answering it. There's a detail in the background of all this that I find oddly charming, which is that when Pedro Pascal first sat down to meet with Jon Favreau about the role, he assumed he was being asked to play Boba Fett, the original armoured Mandalorian bounty hunter, iconic since The Empire Strikes Back. Pascal's response upon learning he was being offered a completely new character instead was apparently something like genuine confusion, followed by delight. He's talked about that moment fondly in several interviews, the realization that he wasn't reprising a legacy character, but building something from scratch. That energy of a new character, with room to grow, unexplored and surprising, was a huge part of what made Season 1 so fresh. The problem with being 6 years into a franchise, with a character who's now as recognizable as Darth Vader in terms of his silhouette, is that the newness has necessarily gone. What replaces it has to be depth, development, genuine transformation, and that's exactly what the film doesn't provide. Din Djarin deserved a better film. Pedro Pascal certainly deserved one. And the frustrating thing is that the raw material is all there. The character, the relationship, the world. The script just never quite figures out what to do with any of it. There's a broader observation worth making about Pedro Pascal's trajectory between the start of The Mandalorian and the film's release, because it adds a dimension to the Din Djarin problem that's easy to overlook. When Pascal took the role in 2018, he was a well-regarded character actor whose biggest profile came from Game of Thrones and Narcos, acclaimed work but not household name work. The Mandalorian made him genuinely famous in the way that very few television roles do. The armor, paradoxically, was what made him a star. The character that required him to hide his face turned him into one of the most recognizable faces in popular entertainment. By 2024, when the film was shooting, he was also the lead of The Last of Us, an HBO series that had become one of the most watched shows in the network's history and had won awards in categories The Mandalorian hadn't been nominated for. He was Joel, who had a face and a voice and a 20-year grief arc, and some of the most emotionally demanding scenes on recent television. Comparing the creative space Pascal occupied in those two roles is instructive. Joel required him to do everything he was doing as Din Djarin: physical presence, authority, the carrying of trauma without self-pity, and also to be available as a full person, with a face that could be devastated and tender and furious and lost. The constraints that made Mando a fascinating creative challenge in Season 1 had become, by the time of the film, a straightforward limitation. This isn't a criticism of the Mandalorian concept. It's more an observation that the creative team had never quite solved the problem of how to keep Din Djarin's emotional interiority legible as the series progressed and the audience's expectations grew. Season 1 managed it through extreme economy. Every scene with Din was so precisely constructed that his internal state was conveyed through what was absent rather than what was present. Later seasons and the film seem to have given up on that economy in favour of a more functional approach. Mando does things, those things have outcomes, he moves on. The result is a character who feels less vivid in a bigger, more expensive production than he did in the intimate confines of the original season. And here's a fun detail that sits slightly to the side of all of this. The helmet problem, the "don't show your face to any living being" rule, was actually depicted being broken not just in the Season 2 finale, but slightly earlier, in a sequence that the show handled with considerably less ceremony. The first time Mando's face appeared in full was in a Season 1 episode directed by Taika Waititi, and the scene was played primarily for comedic and dramatic effect in the moment, rather than treated as the profound violation of creed that the finale later made it. There's a version of the criticism that says the show inconsistently treated its own central rule, which made the payoff of the finale both more and less powerful. More powerful because the audience had been reminded what was at stake, less powerful because the stakes had already been played with in a lighter register. These are the kinds of details that feel more significant in retrospect, when you're trying to understand why the emotional architecture of the later seasons and the film feels slightly less solid than the earlier material. In the autumn of 2019, The Mandalorian launched alongside Disney+, and within a week, the internet had broken a little bit. Not in a bad way. In that very specific, rare way where something genuinely delightful appears in popular culture and everyone experiences it at roughly the same time, and the collective warmth is palpable. The child, Grogu, though we didn't know his name yet, appeared at the end of the first episode, pulled back the hood of his cradle, blinked his enormous eyes, and that was it. The discourse around that reveal felt genuinely joyful in a way that the internet manages maybe 3 or 4 times a decade. The memes were immediate and affectionate. The merchandise was announced months after the character had been properly introduced. The phrase "Baby Yoda" became an internet fixture within days of the character's first appearance. Even though he isn't actually Yoda, he's a member of Yoda's species, which the show has never named. And even though the showrunners had been extremely careful not to reveal him in any pre-release promotional material, the secrecy around Grogu's introduction was itself part of the magic. In an era when every major franchise film and television event gets leaked and spoiled and discussed to death before it even arrives, here was a complete surprise. A character nobody had known existed, who immediately became one of the most beloved things in popular culture. That doesn't happen very often. 13 million Grogu toys sold in the first 2 years of the show's release. That number is staggering. It suggests a character who connected with audiences not just as Star Wars fans, but as people who wanted that specific creature. In their home, on their desk, on their keychain. The cultural footprint was enormous. So what happened between then and now? And why does Grogu feel in this film like a character the creative team doesn't quite know what to do with anymore? Part of it is just time. The mystery around Grogu's origin, the ancient force-sensitive creature of an unnamed species found in a pod, carrying a history we knew nothing about, was a significant source of intrigue in the early episodes. The show gradually answered some of those questions. The flashback to Order 66, the revelation about who saved him from the Jedi Temple, the connection to Yoda's Force lineage. Each of those answers was satisfying in the moment, but they collectively contributed to a character becoming more legible, more explicable, less mysterious. There's also the fundamental constraint that Grogu is nonverbal. He communicates through expressions, gestures, Force abilities, and the occasional sound. That's very charming. It's also a ceiling. In the early seasons, the silence was meaningful. It created space for the audience to project emotion onto him, to read into his expressions, to feel the weight of his unspoken reactions. As the seasons progressed and we knew him better, his silence started to feel less expressive and more like a creative limitation that hadn't been addressed. He can't grow or change in ways that verbal characters can. His development can only be demonstrated through action and ability, not through the things he says or the perspective he develops. In the film, as several critics noted, the creative team genuinely seems to have exhausted what they have to say about Grogu. He does Force things. He eats things he shouldn't eat. He's adorable around small alien creatures. He saves Mando at a critical moment in a touching sequence involving a poison antidote. All of this is Grogu operating at the same level of Grogu he's been operating at for 6 years. There's no escalation, no revelation, no moment that reframes him or asks us to understand him differently. And here's the specific irony that I find genuinely interesting. The film's best audience response came from children under 13. Boys under 13 gave it a perfect score on Post-Track. Parents gave it 5 stars. The Grogu material worked perfectly for its intended audience, the audience for whom the cute creature doing cute Force things has not yet worn thin, for whom every Grogu moment is still novel and delightful, for whom the whole thing is just an extremely good time at the cinema. But that's a different audience than the one the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian had been building. The original show found adult audiences through genre, the Western cadences, the samurai influences, the general vibe of a Kurosawa film set in a galaxy far, far away. It was a show that parents could watch with their kids and genuinely enjoy on its own terms. The film tilts significantly younger than that. The Babu Freak sequence, the Ansellan comedy, the overall diminishment of actual threat or consequence, it's aimed at an audience for whom Grogu cute is a sufficient reason to attend, which is a valid creative choice, but it's a different show than the one a lot of people thought they were invested in, and the sense that the franchise has gradually aged its target demographic downward, from the adult-leaning darkness of Andor at one end of the spectrum to this at the other, is part of the vague dissatisfaction that many people came away from the film carrying. Grogu is still lovely. I want to be clear about that. The puppet work is extraordinary. The animatronic techniques that bring him to life have only gotten more sophisticated. And when he does something warm and unexpected, there's still a version of that original 2019 feeling that surfaces briefly. It's not that the magic is entirely gone. It's that the magic has been so thoroughly optimized for merchandise and family marketing that it can no longer surprise us. And the inability to surprise is, in the end, the thing that turns a phenomenon into a product. There's an interesting comparison to be made with other pop cultural characters who've experienced something similar, where the delightful, mysterious thing becomes the ubiquitous, familiar thing, and you can trace the exact moment the switch flipped. The minions from the Despicable Me franchise are the most extreme example. Characters who were charming, supporting figures in the original film who became so thoroughly commodified that they're now cultural shorthand for a particular kind of gormless corporate cute. I'm not saying Grogu is there. He's not there. But the trajectory rhymes. What the creative team might have done differently is an interesting question to sit with quietly. The decision to make Grogu's Force abilities progressively more powerful and more defined giving him specific skills, showing him using them in particular ways, made him more useful as an action character, but less mysterious as a presence. Mystery was a significant part of his original appeal. The early seasons used Grogu's abilities sparingly and with a sense of genuine awe, as though even the characters on screen didn't quite understand what they were dealing with. That sense of awe faded as the character became more legible. There was also a choice made very early in the show's life that might have been more consequential than it appeared at the time. Naming him. For the first 2 seasons, he was simply the child, or Baby Yoda in the cultural discourse. Even though that wasn't his name, the absence of a name was part of his mystery. In late season 2, we learned his name is Grogu, which Ahsoka Tano deduced through Force communication. It's a lovely moment in the episode, and narratively it makes sense, but there's something about the act of naming, of making the unknown legible in the most basic possible way, that quietly accelerated the character's transition from mystery to familiarity. None of these are catastrophic choices. They're reasonable, creative decisions that each made sense in context. It's the accumulation of them over 6 years that produces a character who now feels thoroughly known, and therefore, in a franchise that runs on novelty and wonder, slightly less essential than he once was. Now let's talk about the supporting players, because the cast of the Mandalorian and Grogu is on paper genuinely remarkable, and what was done with most of them is one of the film's more interesting quiet failures. Sigourney Weaver plays Colonel Ward, the New Republic officer who assigns Mando his missions throughout the film. She is, to put it in the mildest possible terms, a science fiction legend. Alien, Aliens, Ghostbusters, Galaxy Quest, Avatar, Weaver has a career in genre filmmaking that spans nearly 5 decades and includes performances that have become genuinely iconic. The specific quality she brings to those roles, authority that doesn't condescend, intelligence that's always slightly ahead of the scene, a particular kind of wry self-awareness, would be enormously useful in a Star Wars film that wanted to say interesting things about the New Republic's relationship to its morally compromised assets. And she does bring those qualities to Colonel Ward, as far as the film allows. One review described her performance as having a snappish yes I belong in a Star Wars movie, but not totally auteur, which I think is precisely right. She's clearly making careful choices. She's playing a woman who knows the compromises she's making by sending a bounty hunter with a Force-sensitive child into dangerous territory, and who isn't entirely comfortable with those compromises, but has decided they're necessary. There are shades of a genuinely interesting character in there. The problem is that she essentially disappears from the film until the final battle once the mission is assigned. Ward gives Mando his task, appears briefly a couple of times thereafter to receive updates, and then surfaces again for the conclusion. She doesn't have an arc. She doesn't change, develop, face a meaningful decision, or emerge from the film as anything other than the handler who set the plot in motion. You've cast Sigourney Weaver to play a narrative function, and the film doesn't feel embarrassed about this in the slightest. Jeremy Allen White's Rotter the Hutt is, against most expectations, genuinely one of the film's more entertaining elements. The casting announcement, the Bears Emmy-winning lead voicing Jabu the Hutt's son, generated a lot of confused amusement when it was revealed, which was probably the right response. Rotter is a fully CGI slug creature, so White is contributing voice only, and the voice he's chosen is this laid-back sardonic drawl that makes Rotter feel like the first Hutt who's genuinely interesting as a personality, rather than as a visual grotesque. The Bro Hutt description that appeared in at least one review is accurate and also slightly affectionate. White's Rotter is a gangster's son who grew up in his father's shadow and has developed a kind of weary irony about his own criminal legacy. There's a real character there. And then, of course, he's rescued, and the film moves on, and we don't really get to spend any more time with him. Which is a shame because in a film full of characters who feel functional rather than fully realised, Rotter is one of the few new elements that genuinely makes you want more. Now, Martin Scorsese. Jon Favreau and Martin Scorsese have known each other for a long time. Favreau had a small role in Favreau's Elf. Wait, no. Let me think. They go back through the general Hollywood social ecosystem of directors who cross paths at festivals and industry events, and who have mutual respect for each other's work. Favreau has spoken about Scorsese's influence on his approach to filmmaking in a general sense. The nature of the friendship that would lead to Scorsese agreeing to voice a supporting character in a Star Wars film, specifically a line cook at what appears to be a galactic cantina, named Hugo, who has a crucial piece of information that Mando needs, is not entirely clear. But it exists, and the result is that at some point in the middle of the Mandalorian and Grogu, Martin Scorsese's voice says, "Star Wars dialogue as a small alien chef." And this is just a thing that happened. I mean, no notes. Truly, Steve Blum returns as Zeb Orrelios, the Lasat warrior from Star Wars Rebels, the beloved animated series that ran from 2014 to 2018. For fans of that show, it's a genuinely warm inclusion. Zeb is a character with a full, complicated history, and Blum has voiced him for years. For anyone who hasn't watched Star Wars Rebels, he registers as a large purple alien who's clearly on Mando's side and clearly matters to someone, somewhere. The film doesn't pause to explain who he is or why we should care. That's a choice you can make in a franchise film, lean into the lore and reward the faithful, but it does mean that a significant portion of your audience experiences one of your supporting characters primarily as background texture. Johnny Coyne as the Imperial Warlord Jarrow is the most comprehensively wasted performance in the film, though through no fault of his own. Jarrow is given a forceful introduction, a threatening atmosphere, and then a climactic defeat that resolves with less ceremony than the early action sequences. He's the villain. He functions as a villain. He's not a character. The pattern across all of these is consistent. Good actors dropped into functional roles, moved through their scenes efficiently, and sent on their way before any of them can develop into something genuinely memorable. The film has its eyes so firmly on the next plot beat that it never pauses long enough to let any of its supporting cast breathe. And here's a fun detail worth noting in the context of all of this. The cast list for The Mandalorian and Grogu includes 2 Oscar winners, an Emmy winner, and one of the most decorated film directors alive, appearing in a voice role. That's an extraordinary assemblage of talent for a film that its own Rotten Tomatoes consensus describes as threadbare in narrative thrust. There's something almost poignant about it. The Sigourney Weaver situation is worth returning to, because it reveals something specific about the creative priorities of the film. Weaver's Colonel Ward is positioned as the adult in the room, the New Republic official who understands the compromises required to protect a fragile democratic order, who is willing to use a morally complicated man for morally uncomplicated ends. That's a rich character premise. It raises questions about institutional ethics and the use of force that are genuinely relevant to Star Wars' ongoing exploration of how good systems get corrupted. Give Ward a meaningful arc. Give her a decision that costs her something, or reveal that she's more conflicted than her professional manner suggests. Or let her relationship with Mando develop beyond transactional, and you have a supporting character who actually supports the film's themes. Instead, the film treats her exactly as it treats every other supporting character, as infrastructure. She delivers information, she enables the plot, she stands in the background of the climax. The questions her character might raise are never asked because asking them would require the film to slow down and think about itself in a way it's clearly not interested in doing. I find myself wondering what Weaver made of the material. She's been in enough large franchise productions to understand the landscape, the Alien films, the Avatar franchise, various superhero and science fiction properties across 5 decades. She knows what it looks and feels like when a large studio production gives a character genuine interior life, versus when they're being asked to be impressive window dressing. I suspect she knew exactly what Colonel Ward was, and brought her full professionalism to bear anyway. That's what experienced actors do. But I'd be interested to hear her unguarded account of the experience at some point in the future when everyone involved has moved on to other things. The Jeremy Allen White casting one more time, because I do think it deserves more credit than it got. The decision to take a performer primarily known for playing a psychologically complex, emotionally volatile human chef in a prestige drama and have him voice a CGI slug with gangster vibes and a soft spot for a Force-sensitive toddler is an act of creative surrealism that I genuinely admire. It shouldn't work. White's rotter shouldn't be one of the more memorable things in the film. And yet, there's a critical observation that surfaced in essentially every negative review of The Mandalorian and Grogu, phrased in slightly different ways but always arriving at the same place. This is a television episode wearing a cinema suit, and the suit doesn't quite fit. One review, via Fandango, was particularly direct about it. It's a corporate, beige, mid-season television episode that's been ripped off Disney Plus and shoved into a cinema for no reason. Another pointed out, more charitably, that the plot wouldn't have felt out of place as a 3-episode arc in the Disney Plus series. Perfectly reasonable television, not remotely adequate and as a theatrical event. The comparison that several critics reached for was Star Trek, the motion picture, the 1979 film that took the original Star Trek television series to the big screen for the first time. And whatever you think of that film, it's slow, it's ambitious to a fault, it's occasionally baffling, it genuinely tries to justify its own existence as cinema. The scale is deliberately vast in a way the TV show could never have achieved. The central mystery is designed for a feature-length exploration. It feels like a film that understood what cinema asks of you, even if it didn't entirely succeed at meeting that ask. Nobody watching it felt like they were watching 3 episodes of Star Trek with the title cards removed. The difference between television and cinema is not simply one of screen size or budget. It's a difference in the implicit contract between the work and its audience. When you sit down to watch a television episode, even an excellent one, you're engaging with a chapter, something that exists as part of a longer series that inherits context from what came before and deposits something for what comes after. The emotional stakes are often deliberately incomplete. You're meant to be left wanting more. The pacing can afford to meander because there's always next week. When you go to the cinema, you're engaging with a whole, a contained experience that ideally feels complete in itself. The stakes should be sufficient to justify your full, sustained attention. Something should change in the world of the film, or in your understanding of the characters, or in both. You should leave with a sense of having witnessed something that couldn't have existed anywhere else. The Mandalorian and Grogu is very comfortable feeling like a chapter. It doesn't try to be a whole. The characters are in roughly the same place at the end as they were at the beginning. The world hasn't shifted meaningfully. The fetch quest structure, task, complete, new task is the structure of episodic television, not a film, and the film doesn't seem troubled by any of this. What's interesting about this problem, and what I find myself turning over in the small hours, is that it reflects something broader about how Disney has been developing its intellectual properties across the last decade. The Marvel Cinematic Universe ran into precisely the same issue during its Phase 4 streaming expansion. Television shows that functioned as extended backstory for films that assumed you'd watched all the television, the line between formats blurring until neither quite worked on its own terms. WandaVision was compelling television that felt disorienting as an MCU product. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness was a film that required you to have done streaming homework before it made emotional sense. The blurring of these formats serves one master very efficiently, the platform. If everything connects and everything is required context for everything else, viewers are kept in a state of perpetual obligation to the service. But it doesn't serve stories which have their own requirements that don't particularly care about subscription retention. The Mandalorian and Grogu has a specific version of this problem. It assumes a level of investment in characters and lore that only committed fans of the streaming series will bring to the cinema. The cameo characters from Rebels, the New Republic political context, the significance of the various factions, all of this is background knowledge that the film doesn't pause to establish, because it was established in 3 seasons of television. Fair enough for the faithful. A slightly alienating experience for anyone who's drifted away, or who was hoping a theatrical release might function as a genuine new entry point. And then there's the question of what a genuinely cinematic Star Wars film looks like in this era. I think about this more than is probably healthy. The original trilogy worked as cinema partly because it built an entirely new world with no prior knowledge required, and partly because each film had a complete emotional arc of its own. A New Hope is a self-contained adventure story. The Empire Strikes Back is a tragedy with a cliffhanger. Return of the Jedi is a resolution. They're linked, but each one stands alone. Rogue One, which I'd argue is the most successful post-Lucas theatrical Star Wars, works for a similar reason. It's a self-contained heist story with a clear beginning, middle and end that doesn't demand prior investment. The Mandalorian and Grogu is not designed to stand alone. It's designed to serve an audience that's already there. And that's a fine strategy for sustaining a franchise. It's just not what cinema at its best does. Let me spend a moment with Rogue One, because I think it's the most useful counterexample. Rogue One, a Star Wars story, was released in 2016, directed by Gareth Edwards, and it's the film that I'd point to as the most successful piece of post-Lucas theatrical Star Wars. Its premise sounds uninspiring in summary, the story of how the Rebel Alliance stole the Death Star plans, which we already knew from the opening crawl of the 1977 film. The outcome is not in doubt. Everyone who knows Star Wars knows these characters are going to succeed, and they know they're all going to die. And yet Rogue One works as cinema, genuinely works, in a way that several of the Skywalker saga films didn't, and that the Mandalorian and Grogu doesn't. The reason is that Edwards and his writers committed completely to the film's emotional logic, the tragedy of people who gave everything for a cause they'd never lived to see succeed. They killed everyone. They were willing to lose all of it. The final act of Rogue One, from the desperate battle on Scarif to the quiet horror of Vader in the corridor, has the emotional weight of genuine sacrifice, because the creative team was willing to follow their story to its proper conclusion without flinching. That kind of creative courage, the willingness to follow a story where it needs to go rather than where the brand strategy requires it to go, is what makes the difference between a film that's merely enjoyable and one that stays with you. The Mandalorian and Grogu is enjoyable. It's a fine 2 hours in a cinema, particularly if you're 9 years old. It will not stay with you. It didn't cost anything, and you can feel the absence of cost in every safe choice the third act makes. I keep coming back to the question of what this franchise is willing to lose. Every great story requires its characters to lose something real, comfort, certainty, safety, someone they love. The stories that last are the ones where the loss feels genuine and the cost feels proportionate to the stakes. Star Wars used to understand this in the original trilogy. It's become increasingly reluctant to accept it in the current era, and the films and shows that most clearly demonstrate that reluctance, the ones most wrapped in the franchise's commercial anxiety, are precisely the ones that feel hollow. Numbers, then. Because numbers tell a story even when the people releasing them would prefer to frame it differently. The Mandalorian and Grogu opened to $82 million domestically over its 3-day opening weekend, expanding to $102 million over the 4-day Memorial Day holiday. Global figures came to $165 million for the 4-day frame. Those are the headline numbers, and Disney's initial response to them was cautiously positive. The film exceeded some pre-release projections, and the 4-day domestic total was roughly in line with what the studio had been hoping for, if at the lower end of the range. The framing, though, rather depends on what you're comparing to. The film's opening represents one of the worst inflation-adjusted debuts for a live-action Star Wars film in decades. The comparisons being drawn most frequently, and they are not flattering, are to Solo, a Star Wars story, which holds the unenviable distinction of being the only theatrically released Star Wars film to genuinely bomb. Solo opened to $84 million over its traditional 3-day Memorial Day weekend in 2018. The Mandalorian and Grogu came in just behind that. Adjusted for inflation, it's performing considerably worse. Historically, it's sitting alongside some of the franchise's weakest theatrical performances. A strange place to find the film that was supposed to mark Star Wars' triumphant return to cinemas. The cinema score, though, is interesting. The film earned an A- from exit pollers, which is meaningfully better than The Rise of Skywalker's B+. Cinema score measures immediate-to-audience satisfaction, how people felt walking out of the cinema on opening day, and an A- for a franchise film is a genuine, positive signal. The audience that showed up liked it. That's not nothing. The split between the audience score and the critical score is one of the more revealing data points about this film. The Mandalorian and Grogu has an 89% audience score and a 62% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, a 26-point gap. That's not a case of pretentious critics dismissing populist entertainment. That kind of gap typically indicates a film that works well for one specific audience and struggles to justify itself to anyone outside that group. In this case, the audience that loved it, predominantly families with young children, overwhelmingly positive cinema score among boys under 13, and the audience that was ambivalent, adult Star Wars fans, general cinephiles, people who sat through Andor and then came to this, are genuinely different groups with different expectations. Boys under 13 gave the film a perfect 5 out of 5 on Post-Track. Parents gave it the same. That's the film that the Mandalorian and Grogu actually is. An excellent family film for children who love Baby Yoda. A somewhat frustrating experience for adults who wanted Star Wars to mean something again. The true financial picture is also more complex than the headline opening weekend suggests. The production budget was not cheap, but marketing costs for a film of this scale routinely add a significant sum to that figure, potentially pushing the true break-even point considerably higher. The theatrical revenue split means that studios typically take less than the full ticket price from each sale, particularly in international markets. The global 4-day total is encouraging, but not yet at the level that indicates comfortable profit on a film with this kind of marketing spend. There's also the broader context of where this film sits in the franchise's financial history. The Force Awakens opened to over $500 million globally in a single weekend, The Last Jedi to over $450 million. Even the divisive Rise of Skywalker cleared over $170 million globally in its first 3 days. The Mandalorian and Grogu is operating in a completely different commercial register to those films, and it's operating there for the first theatrical Star Wars release on its theatrical return since 2019, which is not the reset the franchise was presumably hoping for. And here's the comparison that makes Lucasfilm's situation genuinely complicated. Skeleton Crew, the streaming Star Wars series that aired during the holiday season with a family-friendly hook and a Goonies in space premise, arrived to poor viewership despite every advantage of timing and platform. The theatrical film is performing weakly by franchise standards. The streaming pipeline has produced one genuinely acclaimed critical success, Andor, and a series of moderately received or outright disappointing efforts. The data taken together paints a picture of a franchise that is still capable of drawing an audience, but is no longer capable of generating genuine cultural urgency. Whether that's recoverable is a question we'll get into later. For now, the numbers are what they are. Not a catastrophe, not a triumph. A beige opening weekend, which is perhaps the most fitting possible result for a film of this kind. One aspect of the financial picture that's worth dwelling on briefly is the international performance, because Star Wars has always had a particular relationship with overseas markets. The franchise has never been as strong internationally as its domestic numbers might suggest. The brand's cultural roots are deeply American in ways that don't always translate with equal weight globally. The Mandalorian and Grogu earned $64 million at the international box office for a global start of $145 million over 3 days, which represents international performance consistent with the franchise's general pattern, but not the kind of result that changes the overall calculus. Industry analysts have noted for years that Star Wars is an unusual outlier in the blockbuster landscape. For this reason, a franchise of enormous domestic power and more moderate international reach, in an era when the biggest films increasingly depend on global markets for their profitability. The MCU overcame this through characters with more universal archetypes and storylines that didn't depend on American cultural mythology in the same way. Star Wars' very specific mythology, the Jedi, the Force, the Empire, the Rebellion, resonates differently in different markets. Whether Starfighter or subsequent theatrical films can build meaningfully on the international baseline is one of the more interesting financial questions facing the franchise going forward. There's also the long-run dimension. Opening weekend is one data point. The real measure of a film's health is its legs, how it performs in weeks 2, 3, 4, as the audience that wasn't there on day 1 starts to filter through. The A- cinema score suggests word of mouth should be positive, and the family demographic tends to produce strong weekend-over-weekend retention as parents bring kids back for repeat viewings. The Mandalorian and Grogu has a reasonable shot at finishing its theatrical run in solid territory, particularly if the school holiday period produces a second wave of family attendance. Whether that results in a final total that justifies the marketing spend and satisfies shareholders is a slightly different question, and one that will be answered in the coming months. For now, the honest summary is, the film opened below expectations for a franchise of this stature, above expectations for the specific circumstances it was operating in, and in a range that doesn't demand the kind of dramatic creative rethink that Solo's underperformance produced. It's a messy result for a film full of careful, safe choices, which is probably fitting. Let's step back from the film for a bit and talk about the context it arrived into. Because the story of the Mandalorian and Grogu's underwhelming performance isn't just a story about one film. It's a story about what 7 years of streaming content did to a franchise that used to generate genuine cultural events. When The Last Jedi came out in 2017, regardless of how you felt about it, and feelings were extremely varied, to put it gently, it was an event. People queued for tickets. The opening weekend was enormous. Social media spent weeks arguing about it. The conversation was inescapable. Star Wars was still something that happened to the whole culture, not just to the fans. Between the theatrical premiere of The Rise of Skywalker in December 2019 and The Mandalorian and Grogu in May 2026, Disney Plus produced or released on streaming an extraordinary volume of Star Wars content. 3 seasons of The Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, 2 seasons of Andor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka, The Bad Batch, which ran for 3 seasons, Tales of the Jedi and Tales of the Empire, the animated anthology series, Skeleton Crew, several more animated projects, and all of this on top of whatever theatrical or streaming Star Wars content preceded the Disney acquisition. That is an enormous amount of Star Wars, genuinely staggering. If you tried to watch all of it in sequence, you'd be at it for weeks. Now, quantity of content and quality of content are different things, and I want to be careful not to make a lazy argument about how too much automatically equals bad. Some of that output has been genuinely extraordinary. Andor, specifically Andor, is a case study in what Star Wars can be when it trusts its audience completely, operates without the obligation to deliver nostalgia hits, and commits to a political and human story with real stakes and genuine craft. The prison arc in Andor Season 1 is some of the best television produced in recent memory, Star Wars or otherwise. It's the kind of thing that makes you reconsider what the franchise is capable of. But Andor is also something of an outlier. The general pattern of the Disney Plus Star Wars output has been competent execution in the service of safe choices. Shows that revisit familiar characters, familiar settings, familiar conflicts. The Jedi and the Sith and the Empire and the Rebellion, recycled in different combinations, with occasional new additions that rarely disrupt the fundamental formula. Andor is the exception specifically because it set all of that aside and built something from a completely different set of priorities. The consequence of this sustained content pipeline is something that's now being called franchise fatigue, though I think that phrase undersells what's actually happening. Fatigue implies tiredness from overuse. What's happening with Star Wars feels more specific than that. It's the erosion of Star Wars as an event, as a thing that demands your attention and rewards it. When there's always more Star Wars available, always the next series or the next film just around the corner, the individual entries lose the specific weight that comes from scarcity. There's an interesting comparison to be made with George Lucas's original approach to the material. Between Return of the Jedi in 1983 and The Phantom Menace in 1999, there was no theatrical Star Wars. 16 years. Whatever your feelings about the prequel trilogy, and there are many feelings, spanning the full emotional spectrum, the return of Star Wars to cinemas in 1999 was genuinely felt. People who had grown up with the original trilogy as children were now adults, and the franchise's return meant something to them in a way that was partly nostalgia and partly the cumulative power of that 16-year absence. That kind of anticipation is no longer structurally possible in the Disney era because the content never stops. There's always more, and when there's always more, nothing feels irreplaceable. The original trilogy worked as cultural events, partly because they were spaced out over years and felt genuinely unpredictable. The Empire Strikes Back was a shock. Nobody knew Vader was Luke's father in advance. The film ended on a cliffhanger. The whole experience was disorienting in the best way. Return of the Jedi resolved things people had spent 3 years wondering about. Each film was a genuine event in the calendar, surrounded by space. The Mandalorian and Grogu opened on Memorial Day 2026, 8 months after Skeleton Crew wrapped, approximately simultaneously, with Andor Season 2 airing on streaming, and roughly a year before Star Wars, Starfighter is scheduled for May 2027. It's embedded in a content landscape that shows no signs of slowing down. The gap between theatrical releases has been just over 6 years, but the gap between Star Wars experiences has been essentially zero. The audience's appetite for this specific universe has been continuously satisfied, and it's hard to be hungry when you're never given the chance. I want to be clear that I don't think this is anyone's fault in a simple, attributable way. Disney made these decisions because they seemed commercially rational, and many of them were. The Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2 were enormous successes. Andor built genuine prestige. The streaming content served real audiences who genuinely loved it. But the cumulative effect of always more and the specific cost that always more imposes on the significance of any individual entry, that's now visible in a way it might not have been 5 years ago. The question of whether a theatrical Star Wars can feel like a cultural event again is one I genuinely don't know the answer to. There's a useful comparison to other franchises that have navigated something similar. The James Bond series went through a period in the late 1980s and 1990s where it was producing competent but increasingly unremarkable entries that failed to generate the cultural heat of the Connery and Moore eras. Casino Royale in 2006, Daniel Craig's first outing, reset that entirely, largely by stripping back to emotional fundamentals and treating the franchise as though it had something genuinely new to say. It didn't rely on nostalgia. It didn't ask audiences to remember 30 films worth of canon. It was essentially brave about what it was willing to abandon in order to rebuild. The Star Trek franchise did something similar with J.J. Abrams' 2009 reboot, a film that honoured the source material while operating from a completely different emotional register. Whether you liked where it ultimately went or not, the original Star Trek 2009 functioned as a genuine event, a franchise revival that felt like it had a reason to exist beyond brand obligation. It was bold in ways the preceding Trek films hadn't been. Star Wars hasn't had its Casino Royale moment yet. The Force Awakens came close in the sense of restoring excitement, but it achieved that largely through nostalgia rather than genuine reinvention. Andor may be the closest equivalent within the current era, a project that proved the franchise was capable of something genuinely new, but it operated on streaming rather than as a theatrical event, and its audience, while appreciative, wasn't the mass cultural audience that theatrical Star Wars needs to reach. There's something genuinely hopeful about the fact that Andor exists. It proves that Lucasfilm is capable of greenlit risks, capable of backing projects that don't fit the established template, capable of trusting creative teams who want to do something unusual with the material. The challenge is making that creative courage the rule rather than the exception, extending it to theatrical productions, to characters with large existing fan bases, to stories that would require the franchise to accept some uncomfortable, short-term commercial risk in exchange for long-term creative health. Whether anyone in a position to make that call is currently inclined to make it is, I think, the genuinely open question. It would be dishonest and frankly a bit boring to spend an entire script cataloguing disappointments without acknowledging what the film does well. Because it does do things well. Several things, actually, and some of them are done very well indeed. The most consistent praise across critical reviews, from people who disliked the film overall and from people who enjoyed it, was for Ludwig Göransson's score. Göransson has been composing for The Mandalorian since the beginning, and his work has always been one of the show's most underappreciated strengths. He builds the Mandalorian universe's sound from a specific palette, a processed stringed instrument he made himself for the original series, spare percussion, wide melodic space, and the result is music that feels genuinely new to Star Wars, while still sitting comfortably in the franchise's tonal world. In the film, he expands that palette without abandoning it. The score for the AT-AT sequence is extraordinary. There's a building tension that releases at exactly the right moment, timed perfectly to the physical spectacle of a walker falling in slow motion down a mountainside. It's one of those pieces of film music that makes a sequence feel more significant than the images alone might justify. Even critics who found the plot thin and the character work insufficient tended to acknowledge that the film sounds exactly right. Göransson's music gives the Mandalorian and Grogu a gravitas it doesn't always earn through its script. The AT-AT sequence itself is worth dwelling on. The film opens with it, Mando arriving on that snowy planet, dismantling an Imperial holdout, and at its centerpiece the slow, catastrophic collapse of one of cinema's most iconic pieces of military hardware down a mountainside. It's shot and edited with real care. The scale is properly cinematic in a way that justifies the IMAX frame. For the first 10 minutes or so, the film delivers on the specific promise of what a theatrical Star Wars event should feel like. It doesn't fully sustain that promise across 2 hours, but the opening is quite genuinely good. The wolf and cub emotional through line, Mando and Grogu as a family unit, the father and son bond that has been the franchise's most reliable source of warmth, is still present, even in a film that doesn't give it adequate room to develop. There are moments, quiet ones, where the dynamic reasserts itself, and you remember why these characters became so beloved. A sequence where Grogu revives Mando after a poisoning, carefully, painstakingly, drawing on the Force in a way that requires genuine effort, has the kind of unhurried tenderness the first 2 seasons were full of. It's brief, but it's there. And then there's the audience response, which I think is genuinely important to take seriously rather than dismiss. Boys under 13 gave this film a perfect score. Parents gave it 3.5 stars. Children in the cinema were, by all accounts, completely engaged, delighted by the Grogu sequences, wide-eyed during the action, fully present in a way that children rarely are, for 2 hours of anything. There's something that I find quietly moving about this, actually. The children in the audience in 2026 weren't watching the film with the weight of 6 years of accumulated expectation and critical context. They were watching a film about a good dad with cool armor and his very small, very powerful green companion, and they loved it. The film worked for them, the way The Phantom Menace worked for children in 1999, regardless of what adult audiences thought about the midi-chlorians and the Trade Federation politics. Sometimes, the most honest response to a Star Wars film is the one from the 8-year-old in the row ahead of you. Jeremy Allen White's Rotter is, as noted earlier, a genuinely entertaining presence. The character has a sardonic bro energy that shouldn't work for a CGI slug creature, and somehow does. Martin Scorsese voicing a cantina cook is the kind of choice that exists in a completely separate register from everything else in The Mandalorian and Grogu, and is better for it. The gladiatorial arena set piece has real energy. The practical creature effects work is excellent. The Anzalans and the various alien designs maintain the franchise's tradition of tactile, inventive creature building. And Pedro Pascal, for all that his character is underwritten and his motivations thin, is working hard behind the helmet. There's a real physical presence in this performance, a solidity and focus that makes Mando feel like a person, rather than a suit. Pascal takes the material more seriously than the material takes him, and that gap between the effort of the performance and the thinness of what he's been given is, in its own odd way, a kind of tribute to what this character has meant to him. The cinema score tells you that the audience who went to see this film on opening day largely got what they came for. The 89% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes tells you the same thing. This film has real defenders, and their defense is valid. It's a very good time at the cinema, if you're the right audience for it. That's not a small thing. That's actually the point of most of what gets made. There's something worth naming about how the film's marketing worked emotionally, which is that it was selling the audience its own nostalgia back to them. The trailers leaned heavily into Goranson's established themes, that distinctive processed instrument, that spare melodic line. Here is the sound you love, the sound that means Mando and Grogu, the sound that takes you back to 2019 and the first time you watched Season 1. It's effective marketing, and the debt it's drawing on is real. The first 2 seasons generated genuine emotional investment, and audiences arrived carrying it. The moments that land do so because of everything that came before them, not because of anything the film itself builds from scratch. The generational split in the audience scores says something true about what the film actually is. Audiences who discovered Star Wars through The Mandalorian, who have no particular relationship with the original trilogy, seem to have responded with considerably less ambivalence than those who came via the classic films. For viewers without the franchise's full weight of expectation, this is simply a fun adventure about a cool dad and his green son. that might, in fact, be the most honest response available. The children who gave it perfect scores aren't wrong. They're seeing it clearly, without the interpretive overlay that older fans carry, and there's something quietly nice about that. It's just not the film that a 7-year absence from the cinema demanded. But that's a different complaint. Since we're on the topic of what works, the production design, more broadly, deserves acknowledgement. The Star Wars universe has always been defined by a particular texture, the lived-in quality that George Lucas and his collaborators established in the original trilogy, the sense that every surface has been used and worn and repaired. The environments in The Mandalorian and Grogu maintain that tradition well, even when the action within them is rote. Nal Hutta has a specific swampy rottenness that's different from Tatooine's sand and grit, a lushness that implies decay. The New Republic base feels bureaucratic in the way that the best Star Wars institutional settings do, functional, slightly underfunded, more provisional than the Empire's austere precision. These are small pleasures, but they're reliable ones. The creature work throughout, as noted, is excellent. The Mandalorian series has always been committed to practical creature effects, where possible, actual suits, actual puppets, actual physical presences on set, alongside the actors, and the film continues that tradition. The result is a tactile quality that CGI-heavy sequences lack. When something bumps into Grogu, it feels like it actually bumped into him. When a creature moves through a space, it occupies that space in a way that composited digital creatures often don't. These choices cost more time and money than pure digital work, and they're worth it. And Göransson's score, I keep coming back to it because I think it's doing more work than any other single element of the film to justify the cinema experience. There's a sequence late in the film, during the final confrontation, where the music shifts from action score urgency into something quieter and more elegiac that suggests the score is telling a slightly more interesting emotional story than the images are. Göransson has given this film a depth of feeling that it doesn't always earn visually or dramatically. That's a remarkable achievement. The specific quality of the score for the Mando and Grogu quiet moments is worth noting as well. There's a recurring motif, a simple, spare, melodic line that appears in the intimate scenes between the two characters, that has evolved meaningfully across the seasons in the film. It began as something tentative and slightly melancholy, reflecting Mando's reluctance. By the film, it has a warmth and fullness that communicates the relationship's history without a word being spoken. That's precisely the kind of thing great film music should do. Tell the emotional story beneath the surface story. Göransson is doing that here, quietly and consistently, and it elevates the material around it. There's a Star Wars film scheduled for May 2027, Star Wars Starfighter. Not a great deal is publicly known about it yet, though the title suggests a focus on the franchise's aviation mythology, X-Wings, dogfights, the specific visual language of the space combat sequences that have been central to Star Wars since the first film's trench run. Whether it's set in the familiar eras or somewhere new, whether it's a standalone story or another piece of the ongoing franchise tapestry, all of that has already been announced. What we know is that the franchise is pressing forward. The opening weekend of the Mandalorian and Grogu has not, apparently, caused anyone at Lucasfilm to pause and reconsider the theatrical pipeline. That's probably the right call. One underwhelming opening weekend, underwhelming by franchise standards anyway, doesn't necessarily indicate a terminal problem. Star Wars has had mixed results before, and recovered. The sequel trilogy was divisive enough that people were writing franchise obituaries by 2019, and yet here we are with ongoing films and streaming series, and a genuine audience that clearly still shows up. The question of whether The Mandalorian and Grogu gets a sequel is genuinely interesting to consider. The film ends with the characters in a state that could continue. No one is dead. No major situation is definitively resolved. the galactic conflict remains ongoing. The franchise has its next theatrical event already scheduled. Whether Mando and Grogu will feature in it, or whether the plan is to give the Mandalorian verse a rest while something new takes the spotlight, that hasn't been confirmed either way. What I find myself more interested in is the Andor factor, and what it means for how we assess the franchise right now. Season 2 of Andor is currently airing on Disney Plus as The Mandalorian and Grogu opens in cinemas. And the critical response to it has been, if anything, even more effusive than Season 1. Reviews describe it as genuinely extraordinary television, complex, politically serious, emotionally devastating, willing to treat Star Wars as a universe capable of depth and ambiguity, rather than purely as a backdrop for mythology and adventure. It's winning the kind of praise that studios spend years trying to manufacture and almost never achieve. The contrast between Andor and The Mandalorian and Grogu, released about a year apart but both set in the same fictional universe, aimed at audiences who presumably overlap significantly, is striking. One is operating at the absolute ceiling of what the franchise can do. The other is operating somewhere in the comfortable middle. Both are Star Wars, both are Disney Plus or theatrical products from the same studio. The coexistence of those two very different levels of creative ambition in the same franchise at the same moment is one of the most interesting things about where Lucasfilm is right now. It suggests that the problem with The Mandalorian and Grogu is not that Star Wars is incapable of greatness in the current era. Andor is evidence against that argument. The problem is more specific. This particular creative team, with these particular characters, appears to have run out of things to say. And rather than acknowledging that and making space for something new, the franchise machinery kept turning, producing something that functions adequately but doesn't justify itself. What a genuinely great theatrical Star Wars would look like in 2026 is something I think about more than is probably reasonable for an adult person. My honest answer is that it would need to be genuinely surprising. Not surprising in the Luke Skywalker cameo sense, that's nostalgia bait, and we've seen how quickly that particular magic fades. Surprising in the sense of telling a Star Wars story that nobody has told before, set in a part of the universe we haven't overexplored, with characters who don't have existing fan bases and existing merch lines and existing emotional obligations. Rogue One found a version of this by treating a familiar event, the theft of the Death Star plans, as a genuinely tragic heist film with a cast of new characters who we cared about specifically because they weren't protected by the expectations we bring to legacy figures. It worked because the creative team committed to something that didn't play it safe. The Mandalorian and Grogu played it extremely safe. And there's a version of that which is just commercially sensible, and there's another version which represents a creative failure of nerve. I suspect it's some of both. The franchise will continue. Another theatrical film in 2027. More streaming content. At some point, presumably, more Andor. There are interesting things ahead. Whether any of them recapture the specific cultural electricity of The Mandalorian Seasons 1 and 2, or of A New Hope seen for the first time, or of The Empire Strikes Back landing its twist, that seems genuinely uncertain. Those moments are rare, they can't be scheduled, and the impulse to replicate them by revisiting the characters and settings and situations that produced them, rather than trying to build something genuinely new, is precisely what seems to be preventing the next one from arriving. I'll be watching Starfighter when it comes out, though. Of course I will. That's the thing about these franchises for those of us who grew up with them. The hope is remarkably durable. It survives a lot of beige, and there's a version of optimism here that I think is genuinely warranted, though I want to be careful not to reach for it too quickly. The theatrical Star Wars landscape in 2027 will be different from 2026, because the context will have shifted. The Mandalorian and Grogu has now re-established the franchise's theatrical presence. It's reminded audiences, however ambivalently, that Star Wars cinema exists. Starfighter, arriving a year later, won't carry the weight of a 7-year absence. It will exist in a cleared space. What it does with that space is everything. If it's a genuinely new story, different setting, different characters, a tone and register that isn't drawing on the Mandoverse continuity or the Skywalker mythology or the New Republic political situation, there's a real chance it lands as a creative reset. If it's another serving of familiar, if it continues the franchise's recent pattern of preferred safety over surprise, the conversation we're having now will continue at roughly the same volume. I'd also note, in the spirit of honesty about my own reactions, that the Andor Season 2 situation complicates my feelings about all of this in ways that are hard to fully articulate. Watching something genuinely extraordinary happening in the Star Wars universe at the same moment as something adequate happening in a cinema, the coexistence of those two things produces a specific kind of complicated emotion. It's not frustration exactly. It's something more like the franchise is clearly capable of this, and the choices being made about where to direct that capability are not always the right ones. That's a hopeful observation as much as a critical one. Capability is there. The question is only will. For Din Djarin and Grogu specifically, I find I do still care what happens to them. Even after an underwhelming film, even after a disappointing third season, even after all of the accumulated commercial compromises, the kernel of warmth at the center of their dynamic is still there, still real, still worth something. A good story about these characters is still possible. It would require creative choices the franchise hasn't been willing to make, but it's possible. That's not nothing, and that's where I'll leave it for tonight. We covered a lot of ground, from a season finale that felt complete and wasn't left alone, through 3 years of quietly accumulating problems, through a film that arrived with great expectations and delivered something pleasant and forgettable, a quiet Memorial Day. Not a disaster in the spectacular sense, just a film that didn't quite earn what it was asking of its audience. I've got a few things I'm planning for future videos in this area, if any of this has been interesting to you. I'd like to do a proper deep dive on Andor, on what it got right, and how it managed to make a Star Wars story feel genuinely urgent and new. And at some point I want to go back through the Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2 properly, look at why they worked so well, and think about what specifically was lost as the show expanded and the characters became more valuable as properties than as people. But that's for another evening. One last thing worth sitting with: how quickly the conversation about this film moves from the film itself to everything surrounding it. What Season 3 got wrong, what the franchise should do next, what Andor does differently, what the box office means. The film becomes a conversation prompt rather than a thing in itself. A great film generates conversations about itself, about what it meant, what it felt like, what stayed with you. A merely adequate franchise film generates conversations about the franchise. That distinction feels like the most precise description of what went wrong here, and why the collective response has been a shrug rather than an argument. For now, I hope the galaxy felt like reasonable company for wherever you're drifting off to